as you go through this mock exam review, use your green pen to give yourself reflections and marks, and if this works right, as it does for the sixth formers and as it has done in years gone by, I'll be marking your reflections and your marking more than your actual answer. Of course, I'll still give you marks, but your reflections will be really important because this mark doesn't matter. It's only your mark at the end that matters. If you can think for yourself and recognise where you've lost marks or where you've won marks, that's far more valuable than me writing down and me understanding where you've done it. So I really want to see lots of green pen on this work. Like I say, have a go at giving yourself a mark for each question, and certainly have a go at scrolling on where you've gone right, where you've gone wrong. The first question is quite simple in so far as how to set it out, because it's already set out for you. All you need to do is know what infer is, and it is to read between the lines, to not pick out the obvious. So, in this case, if you'd have said that the media was against the war, that might be a little bit too obvious. But you can see an example there. The media played an important role in encouraging opposition to the war. The information that tells me this is actions by opponents of the war were supported by the news media. So, you see, you pick out an inference, you pick out the quotes. You can see the examples there in the mark scheme on the screen. Pause, see if you've got a similar sort of thing. If you need anything clarifying, pop your hand up, I'll come over and help. See if you think you've got 4 marks out of 4. If you have, give yourself 4 marks out of 4 in your green pen at the side. I will check this marking and everything else that you do. For this answer, I'm going to take you to the video that I made to help you revise. I'm going to take you to that question where I went through exactly what I would have put in the answer. Domino theory, of course, was this idea of a domino train. If one country fell to communism, then the country next door would be next. And people in America believed this because that appeared to be what was happening. Countries all across Eastern Europe fell to communism and they were all next to each other. And the same was happening over in Asia, where China, which is next, shares a border with the USSR, the Soviet Union that is, fell to communism, and then North Korea did, and then here looked like Vietnam was going to. So people genuinely believed that if they didn't make a stand somewhere, communism was just going to keep spreading. And Eisenhower, the president in the 1950s, he believed in it. During the 1950s in America, there was something called the Red Scare. Red is the colour which symbolised communism. And people in America were scared of communism within the United States. There'd been a politician called McCarthy who sort of tried to hunt out communist American government. He'd been exposed as a bit of a fraud, but there was certainly 100% Soviet spies that had infiltrated American government. And we know this, well, we certainly know this because people have, after the fact, said that they were communist spies, and people were caught for it as well. But apart from that, the Soviet Union, a communist country, who were against America in the Cold War, and America's biggest enemy, well, they'd had spies in America were working on the nuclear bomb, and they passed all the secrets of the nuclear bomb to the Soviet Union, so that the Soviet Union had their own nuclear bomb by 1949, just 4 years after the Americans had, well, an American team had created it. So there was a reason for this Red Scare, but it meant that people in America thought that communism was something to be feared, and therefore a stand had to be taken against it. And also, maybe more importantly, the politicians had to be shown to be standing up to communism, because during the Red Scare, if you were accused of being a communist spy, whether it was true or not, that could be your career over. So politicians went out of their way to prove that they were acting hard on communism, which meant, well, Vietnam was a convenient way of proving that you were hard on communism by invading or by supporting the efforts in Vietnam. So the Red Scare was quite important. America being a democracy is very important in understanding this war. That will crop up again in other questions. In a democracy, the leader of the country or the leaders of the country are voted in by the people. So if they want to stay in power, they have to listen to what people think, and that's called popular opinion. And in America, we've already talked about the Red Scare. People also believed in the Domino Theory. People wanted communism to be stopped in America. And because it's a democracy, the leadership had to pay attention to that if they wanted to be voted into power. American presidents or presidential candidates in elections after the Second World War were always talking about being tough on communism. They were going to be the tough guys that were going to stop this evil from spreading. So it's quite important, because how can you prove that you are paying attention to popular opinion? Well, in this case, getting involved in Vietnam. It was the popular thing to do. People wanted it to happen, as proven by polls, which you'll have learnt about from your Quizlets. And we'll go back to this again. This is the thing with these exam booklets. They'll indicate to you what the key bits of knowledge are. Well, there was a lack of support by the end of the war back in America, especially after 1968 and 9 with My Lai and the Tet Offensive coming out in the media. And the lack of support in America. America is a democracy. If public opinion wants something not to happen, the leaders of America have to not do it, or they will find themselves not being re-elected in the next elections, because America is a democracy. So the lack of support for the war later in the 60s and into the early 70s is a very big reason why America lost the war in Vietnam. Just as a lot of support for making a stand against communism was a reason why America got involved. Public opinion sways what the leaders have to do in a democracy. So how useful question. First up is the mark scheme there. And you can see you have to write about why the source is useful, or what it's useful for, as well as what the sources what the limitations of the sources are, why they're not completely useful, why there might be reasons to question them. So let's see what I might have put. So I've decided for source B that it is a useful example of the impact of Brown versus Topeka because it shows a black student in an integrated school. It also shows that Brown versus Topeka was hot news because it's in the newspaper, in a national newspaper, not just a state newspaper. Again, showing how significant that Brown versus Topeka was if it's a massive national news story. And also it says in the provenance of the source, which is the writing where it says where it came from, that this was the first school. And we know from our own knowledge that this is true, that not every school is changed immediately. It took quite a few years before the decision from Brown versus Topeka fed through. But we've also got to look at the limitations. Well, so I put but there, it's a photograph. Probably not showing the typical reaction of everybody, because we know from our own knowledge, or history tells us, that some white people resented the desegregation of schools. But there are smiles here and people look happy with what's going on, and that's probably because they know there's a camera there. Also, they've chosen this image for a reason. The black student is playing an active role in the centre of the lesson. Everybody's respectful, everybody's paying attention. You know, it just seems a bit too good to be true, given that we know how some people reacted to black people being in what had been white-only schools. And finally, a big limitation, of course, is this is only what was going on in one school. So that's source B. But what about source C? Well, it's a useful example of opposition, because, of course, Southern Manifesto, people in the South, white people in the South, white racist people in the South, trying to stop this from happening. And from your Quizlet, you might know that in 1957, 2.4 million black children were still in segregated schools. So that's 3 years after Brown versus Topeka. So therefore this opposition must have had some success, and it shows you what their sort of things they were saying. It also shows that the opposition to the civil rights movement thought Brown versus Topeka was very significant. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't have done this. It's quite a dramatic step to take. I'd been mentioning in my answer that these people, these politicians which were signing the Southern Manifesto, I'd be dropping the word Dixiecrats in there to show I know my stuff. But what are the limitations? Well, it's only representative of the opposition and only in 1956. Doesn't show that eventually all schools were desegregated. And this, by the way, this fact that it's only a snapshot and it's only in one particular year, you can probably apply for your actual exam, to your actual exam. Most sources are only a snapshot. Both sources in this case are. And finally, did you focus on the question? You might have noticed I've used the word significant a lot in me talking to you about this. I've given you a little challenge on there. Focus on significance in your answer. Can you shade it a number of times? If you haven't, you might not have 100% focused on the question. Hopefully, you've written about the usefulness of source B and its limitations, the usefulness of source C and its limitations, referred to the word significance, and referred to specific own knowledge to help you to decide how useful sources B and C are. I hope you've picked out what the differences are in this, and again, this is something you can take to your real exam. They pretty much will say the opposite of each other. Well, that seems to be the pattern anyway. I mean, I can't promise that, but it's one thing to look for. So if you can't understand one of the interpretations, but you understand the other one, chances are that the one you can't understand is probably saying the opposite to the other. And you can see my thoughts down here. Interpretation 1 suggests that Brown versus Topeka was a key turning point and it was crucial for the civil rights movement. You've got to use some words to show difference, so whereas, in contrast, conversely, I'd get that circled, highlighted in your answer to show where you've done it, or I'd scroll around my answer, need to use a word to show difference. But interpretation 2 suggests the opposite, that actually it wasn't. Well, it doesn't suggest the opposite so much as it emphasises the opposite, emphasises the outbreak of opposition and the negative impact of the decision from Brown versus Topeka. So it doesn't contradict interpretation 1, it doesn't say interpretation 1 is wrong, it just has an emphasis on something entirely different, opposition rather than the positive impacts of Brown versus Topeka. On to the most ludicrous exam question I've ever seen, because it requires zero thought from you. It just requires you to memorise this. So you can see there's the examples. You either say the interpretations might be different because they give different weight to different sources. They might be different because they are only partial extracts. So if you'd have read the whole book, it might actually say similar things. Or interpretations might differ because they have different emphasis. As we've already said, interpretation 1 focuses on the positive outcomes, interpretation 2 focuses on the opposition. Ridiculous exam question. If you've memorised them, you get 4 marks out of 4 just for talking about one of them. And finally on to the last and biggest question in all of your papers, 20 marks worth for an interpretation question, possibly the hardest one on the whole of the course. And the first thing you should do when you look down and think, have I written enough? You know, it's 20 marks. It's got to be double any of the other answers on the paper, at least, and then some. So hopefully you left enough time to do this one. And then you can see on the left hand side of things that should be in there. So there should be some quotes taken from the interpretations. Where you refer to history, it's either from my own knowledge I know, or my favourite phrase, history tells us that, to introduce own knowledge. And well, the structure of it, you can kind of see at the bottom right hand corner from the mark scheme and the examples they give. You should write just one sentence saying whether you agree or disagree. One paragraph all about why you might agree with interpretation 2. Another paragraph about why you might disagree with interpretation 2. And a conclusion about overall your ideas. And as it even tells you there, you have to use other interpretation, so use both interpretations, and your own knowledge. And you can see why in the mark scheme if you have a pause and a little read. Well, you can also see my planned answer. Reasons why I would agree with interpretation 2 about the opposition growth from the Brown versus Topeka case. Or Topeka, who knows. And so, well, Little Rock broke out. That was an example of opposition. It wasn't exactly school, it was Mississippi University, but James Meredith was another example of an outbreak of opposition, like the white supremacists trying to fight back. Of course, the White Citizens Councils, they appear earlier in the paper, and they're very relevant as they produced the Southern Manifesto. And a bit of bonus, it's in the textbook, and it is now in the Quizlet. In 1956, the state of Virginia cut off all state aid to desegregated schools. So there was a fight back. Opposition did break out in massive amounts, and that supports the idea that interpretation 2 might be the most valid or the most convincing interpretation. The word convincing would be a fantastic thing for you to have used. And then disagree. Well, I would also mention Little Rock and James Meredith. Both are examples of how the government, the federal government, which means the whole country government, not state government, and the president had to step in on the side of civil rights. So yes, Little Rock and James Meredith, both of those are instances of opposition growing out, but the president stepped in and on the side of civil rights, and in both cases the students had ended up escorted to school by soldiers to go to Little Rock High School, and James Meredith escorted to university. So actually that could be put down as a victory for civil rights. And also by the early 1970s, practically everywhere had desegregated schools, which is an example of the significance of Brown versus Topeka. And for the first time, in terms of Brown versus Topeka, the Supreme Court, one of the most important and powerful institutions would be a good word, in American government, sided with civil rights. And it did that first time, and then it did time after time after time again. Next time being the Montgomery bus boycott. And so yeah, and then you can see one last little bit at the end there. So yeah, there's my take on the last question. I would have a little conclusion, and I'd finish there. So hopefully you're looking down, you're seeing a lot of green pen, a lot of reflections, there's lots for me to look on, lots of you to reflect on, especially with a mind to what you're going to do in the real exam. It's unlikely to be on Brown versus Topeka, although it's probably likely that that is something you could mention. So yeah, be thinking in mind, what have I done here? Have I left myself enough time at the end? Have I structured my answers properly? Have I focused on the question? Have I tackled my targets from previous assessments? And the last thing I would ask you to do, and bonus points, I would be so appreciative if you've done this, is just write me a little conclusion at the end. What is it overall that you're thinking here? What is your main takeaway from what we've seen in your answer? And there we go.